Hi, everyone. My name is Chanel Hasten. I'm the Director of Outreach and Community Relations for the Elakha Alliance. And tonight our webinar is Otterly Impactful, the Economic Return of Sea Otters to the Oregon Coast, featuring our guest, Jordan Bohlander from Dean Runyon Associates. But first, before I pass it off to Jordan, I'm going to give you a little summary about the Elakha Alliance, who we are, and what we are doing here in Oregon. Oops. So a quick little timeline of sea otters. About 2 million years ago, they evolved from modern-day Russia and eventually expanded their population all the way from Baja California, up the coast, across to Alaska, and all the way to Japan. So they had a huge habitat. And then 10,000 years ago, the Native Americans arrived to the Pacific Northwest, and they thrived alongside the sea otter population along the coast, and places like Otter Rock and Otter Point are a direct translation of names given to them by the Tillamook and Tutuni people that lived along the coast. So there was a very strong relationship with our cultural tribes and sea otters. And unfortunately, by 1910, after the maritime fur trade, sea otters were locally extinct in Oregon because they were hunted for their pelts, really substantially. So we haven't had sea otters along our coast for over 100 years. So that brings us to the Elakha Alliance. We are a nonprofit organization created by tribal conservation and nonprofit leaders with a shared vision to restore Oregon's sea otter population. We were conceived informally in 1909 by the late David Hatch from the Siletz tribe. You can see there on the left-hand photo. And we were officially a nonprofit with a 501c3 status in April of 2020. So our mission, if you didn't get it already, is to restore a healthy population of sea otters on the Oregon coast, and in the process help make Oregon's marine ecosystem more robust and resilient. That's ultimately our end goal, is to help our marine ecosystem habitat rebound from the state it currently is in. So there was a translocation attempt in Oregon in the early 70s. So sea otters from Amchitka Island were moved to Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and Southeast Alaska to escape nuclear testing that was happening there. So nearly 100 animals were released along the Oregon coast. There's not a definite reason why they didn't stay around after a decade. They eventually all just disappeared, but the best guess is that there wasn't enough animals released to withstand natural immigration and mortality rates that happen in any translocation experience. So we've learned a lot about that specific translocation, and over 50 plus years now, we have a lot better methods to go off of. So we are very hopeful that another translocation would be more successful. So why sea otters? Why now? So as a keystone species, sea otters have a disproportionately large effect on their environment relative to their abundance or their absence, as we see on the Oregon coast and much of the Northern California coastline as well. So they have a foundational effect on the kelp forest ecosystems. They're key predators to those spiny things, the sea urchins that you see there in the bottom photo. Because sea urchins eat algae, they eat kelp, and so without natural predators in their environment, they're eating kelp at an alarming rate. And so unfortunately, this is what much of the kelp forests are looking like, with urchins coming out from hiding under rocks and crevices and just consuming all the kelp. So just think of it, if some beetles were on land and came and just ate all the trees in the forest that you like to go hiking on if you're here in Oregon. Think of that, because it's kind of hard to understand what's happening underwater when we don't live there. But thankfully we have photographers and videographers that help kind of portray exactly the drasticness of this issue. So sea otters also benefit estuary environments as well. So in the Elkhorn Slough, after sea otters were reintroduced into the slough, they started eating more crabs, which allowed sea slugs and snails to graze on algae that grew on the blades of eelgrass. And so with that change in the ecosystem, that allowed the eelgrass to repopulate and grow and dig their roots down into the sediment, which actually lessened erosion and also increased carbon sequestration. So all in all, really great thing with sea otters being reintroduced into estuaries. So our strategic plan, so we did publish a feasibility study and an economic impact assessment. So that was one step. Currently, we are building regional consensus on restoring a population of sea otters here in Oregon. And then in the future, we want to proceed with the restoration and carefully chosen sites that will be chosen by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service because that is under their jurisdiction. So we're trying to do as much as we can to help them with that process. As I mentioned, we did publish a feasibility study in 2022, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service published their own feasibility assessment on reintroduction of sea otters in Northern Oregon Northern California and Oregon. And the good thing is that sea otter reintroduction in both of those studies is feasible. And so that is great. One step closer to a sea otter reintroduction. There are proven successful reintroduction stories elsewhere in California, Washington, and Alaska. So about 1/3 of sea otters in existence today have successfully been restored in many parts of their historical range, thanks to reintroduction efforts. So there's about 3,000 sea otters in California, about 3,000 in Washington, and about 70,000 in Alaska. So our next steps, outreach and engagement, which is a big part of my position. So going out speaking at events to different groups, universities, retirement communities. You can check our social media, invite us to come speak to your group if you'd like. You can do that through our website. And also gathering information, conducting research studies, which is what will be highlighted today. Some are research we did with Dean Runyon. And broaden our outreach, fill in some more science and socioeconomic gaps in our feasibility study. And we're currently working on a fisheries impact assessment as well. To gain political support, so for you to reach out to your elected officials and let them know that yes, you want sea otters back on the Oregon coast, and it's important for a lot of reasons, and also increase our tribal engagement with our tribes along the coastline here. So make sure to follow us on all the social media platforms. If that's not your thing, sign up for our RAFT newsletter. It comes from me once a month. You can do so easily on our website. And just want to give a shout out to our partners. This is definitely a multi-organizational effort. So thank you to everyone who is helping make that possible. And last but so I want to pass things off to Jordan Bohlander, the Senior Project Manager from Dean Runyan Associates, who's going to talk about a project we hired them to do. And I'll let him talk all about that. And so if you have any questions for Jordan or myself, please use the Q&A feature or use the chat. That is easily accessible as well. And I'll pass it off to you, Jordan.
Thank you, Chanel. Good evening, everybody. So our firm, Dean Runyon Associates, for those who are not familiar, is a market research firm that's been around for a few decades at this point. And our focus has always been on travel and tourism and the economic impacts associated with the activity. So for Elakha Alliance, we worked with them and with another firm called Future Partners to take a look at what the tourism potential would be of reintroduction, to assess the economic benefits, specifically to visitation and tourism within the Southern Oregon coast. The first half of this presentation is information from the visitor surveying work that was done by Future Partners. And so I'm going to try and do as much justice as I can to their work because they're not with us tonight. But this study, the goals were to evaluate the current perceptions of the Southern Oregon coast as a visitor destination, investigate the appeal of certain attractions and services, investigate the kinds of attractions and services that make an increased sea otter population a motivator for visitation, which is very key to establishing economic impact, and for them to gather data for us to use in our economic assessment. They used an online traveler survey that is a panel of adult U.S. travelers. We looked at both past visitation of the Southern Oregon coast and people who've never come. These are all adult travelers, and in our sample, we had 301 visitors who had come in the past 5 years, 120 that had visited before but have not come back to the Southern Oregon coast in the last 5 years, and then 400 individuals who had not visited the Southern Oregon coast at all. And this survey ran for a couple weeks in late 2022. In terms of recent visitation to the Southern Oregon coast, primarily those visitors in the survey are coming from California, Oregon, and Washington. That's not a big surprise for what we know about Oregon travel. It's very regional focused. And again, the Southern Oregon coast very close to California with a lot of large markets such as San Francisco and Los Angeles. Of those recent visitors, they're almost to $100,000 in average household income, and 44% had children in the household. And then they're also well distributed in terms of age. So we see that millennials, Gen X, and boomers are all fairly equally represented in terms of the recent visitation. When we look at those lapsed visitors, those folks who had come before but haven't been recently, again, similar situation, a lot of California visitors, more so than recent, a little bit higher incomes, a little less children in the household, and skew older. And then as we get to the non-visitors, those who haven't come, again, we're heavily dependent on the California market. It is one of the largest state in the country, so there is a lot of visitation that originates from that state. These households have a lot less income comparatively to the other two groups. They are, again, smaller households, less children, and again, skew older than at least the first group, those recent visitors. So when we look at that with past visitation being more, those folks have higher incidence of children within their households, that the Southern Oregon coast is sort of a family travel market destination, or at least has a high potential to be targeting those family travelers. It attracts relatively young and an affluent audience, which, thinking of the region, it is a trek to get there. So it's a little more expensive to travel to that part of the state. But again, it's getting a good mix of demographics within that group. And then the key feeder markets to the region are clearly regional. California, Washington, Oregon make up most of the visitation. So when we look at some recent trips and the recent visitors, about 77% are leisure related. So that means out of all the people who've come and visited, 77% were taking a leisure trip, which has a lot of different qualifications. And the other 23% would be like a business related trip or for some other non-leisure purpose, such as like healthcare travel or potentially visiting friends and relatives. And of that group that responded to the survey, 95% of them were staying overnight. In terms of where they stay or visit within the Southern Oregon coast, And these are multi-response, so the percentages do not add to 100. But we can see most of the major cities represented in the list of Coos Bay, Gold Beach, Port Orford, Bandon. But I do like to note that there's fairly even visitation throughout the entire southern coast. Coos Bay is one of the larger cities, so it makes sense that it does have a higher percent. But generally speaking, it's fairly even distributed visitation throughout southern Oregon coast. And then in terms of the lodging, for those who stay overnight, vast majority are using paid lodging, which we would call hotel, motel, vacation rentals, bed and breakfasts. They're generating, those are usually the higher economic impact travelers. They typically stay longer, spend more. And we can see that here, that the average amount of nights stayed within the destination is approximately 3.6 nights, and then 4.1 days if you include their arrival and departure. And again, spending per day about $559 per party. So the month of the most recent, like last trip that they took, we just see over the last couple, well, at the time of this study for 21 and 22, there is pretty much a summer distribution of visitation. That's typical of travel in Oregon. We do have a very seasonal travel pattern throughout the state where we see most of the visitation occurring in the late spring and summer months, and it is especially true for the coastal areas. And then to dive into a little more specificity on these visitors, we wanted to kind of get some questions about, the importance of wildlife viewing as it relates eventually to sea otters and other types of wildlife. So we asked the question of how important was the availability of wildlife viewing activities in their decision to visit the southern Oregon coast. So we can see that approximately 70% said that it's extremely important or somewhat important to having the availability of these types of activities on their trip. And then again, talking most recent trip on wildlife viewing, which types of activities, experience did you participate on during this trip? And then on your last trip, approximately how much did you spend in total on these activities? So, 34% of individuals participated in a wildlife viewing activity while on a trip to the southern Oregon coast. And on average, they spent about $207 on those activities explicitly. Then we kind of get to satisfaction. So this is kind of satisfaction both with wildlife viewing as our one of the top things of what people are satisfied with, but also the satisfaction regarding the rest of the trip. So we can see that the southern Oregon coast has fairly high satisfaction in a lot of categories. The only one on here that I would say is kind of interesting and outside of what we see in the other patterns is the affordability. But I like to note that during this time, 2021, 2022, coming off of shutdowns in 2020, a lot of things got more expensive for travel in particularly. So affordability in this aspect might be looking at this point in time, things were kind of expensive. But overall, people are very satisfied with the southern Oregon coast as a travel destination. Again, the southern Oregon coast region primarily attracts high-spending leisure travelers. Wildlife viewing is an important destination attribute, which drives a significant share of the visitor's wallet. And the current array of wildlife viewing activities experienced with satisfaction by the region's visitors. So then we kind of asked these folks to think of a trip, not necessarily one they've been on, but a future trip. So the prompt is imagine you're traveling in the Pacific Northwest, and we include all the way up to Alaska. In general, how interested would you be in enjoying wildlife viewing activities while traveling in this area? 54% said very interested, and another 40 were interested. And then to follow up with that, what out of the following types of wildlife, please rank the top 3 you'd be most interested in viewing on this imaginary trip. So out of that ranking, we had whales, sea otters, orcas as the top 3. And I think the key one to focus on here, obviously, is sea otters do have a pretty high importance or a ranking compared to some of the other types of wildlife. Then we asked about, there's a effort currently underway to reintroduce sea otters to the Oregon coast. And then imagine those sea otters have been reintroduced and when you made your recent trip. And then like how likely would you have included a trip to the harbor to view sea otters? And we were thinking of a safe space that people could easily view, whether that was paid or unpaid. But 90% of visitors said they would visit a location to view sea otters. And then there was another question that asked about like what best describes why you would be or have been likely to view sea otters at that harbor. And we can see here to engage in a family-friendly activity, to learn about marine life in the Southern Oregon coast, and to learn about sea otters in general, really are fairly evenly spread. And then a few people were just interested in pictures, which is great too. So if you were to visit the Southern Oregon coast for sea otter related activities, how important would the availability of each of the following be to you? And this is important for later when we get into the economics. So we can see that individuals really like to have infrastructure related to education for the most part. We have aquariums, guided tours, self-guided tours using guides, visitor centers. These things all require, whether they're staffing or other infrastructure components, that may or may not exist currently. So again, key takeaways from the survey: travelers in the West are highly attracted to wildlife viewing opportunities. Sea otters are a compelling destination attribute. The Southern Oregon sea otter viewing would be best positioned as a fun family learning activity. And the reintroduction of sea otters has a high potential to support economic development, though commercial activities like guided tours and the development of new attractions like aquariums is important to that development. So after working with future partners in their survey and getting the findings from that, we really dive into how we're going to analyze the travel impacts related to these visitors. And that's where our specialty comes in. So I've got a few things to cover. That's the general visitation at the moment to the Southern Oregon coast region. Then we have some comparable destinations. So we looked at destinations all throughout the West Coast to kind of get a sense of like where are the gaps in Southern Oregon coast versus elsewhere. And then finally, we'll get to the economic impact of the travel impacts of reintroducing sea otters to the Southern Oregon coast. So for those who are not aware, Southern Oregon coast is the combined region of Coos and Curry County. And when we look at visitation, we also did some geolocation analysis where you draw essentially boundaries on a map, and then you get pings off of cell phone devices and that can tell you where people have come from and some demographic data when you link it back to census and other things like that. This kind of was a good way to also align with the survey to make sure that our data kind of represented the same sorts of origins or destinations we saw in their survey, to kind of confirm that both data sets are telling the same story. But as we saw earlier, Coos Bay, Bandon, Brookings, Gold Beach, the major communities on the coast are where a lot of these visitors are traveling to. And again, like the survey, we can use the location data to look at lengths of stay while in market. And we saw similar patterns to the surveys, we have about 4 days on average in terms of the overnight trips. And then for those who made a day trip out to the coast, the average stay was about 3 hours. Day trip to the Southern Oregon coast is quite a substantial journey. So the incidence of day travel is not as high as overnight in general. And most of the individuals coming out for the day are coming from the lower Willamette Valley. So we talked about travel impacts. The reason we do the work that we do is that the travel industry is an aggregate of pieces of all these other industries. So some are more transparent or easier to define, like lodging, hotels, short-term vacation rentals. Those are very easy to say like that is a tourist-focused entity. But when you talk about things like food services, like restaurants, recreation opportunities, and retail, a vast majority of those businesses in general are supported by the residents who live there and not by travelers. So part of what we do is we look across all these industries using a variety of different primary, secondary data to determine how much of each is contributed to by visitation and travelers. So in 2021, the Southern Oregon coast had approximately $386 million in travel, direct travel spending. So direct spending is, think of yourself on a trip. When you spend money, that is directs. It generated about 163 in employee and business owner earnings. Employed or produced about 5,500 jobs and generated about 16.2 million in state and local taxes. Since 2021, we are now a few years beyond that, but it's similar growth. We've recovered in terms of the way we look at travel spending compared to pre-pandemic. And the Southern Oregon coast has always been about 4% of all travel spending in the state of Oregon, and it continues to be at about that level in the more recent years. When we look at just Coos and Curry County, we see that just Coos County is slightly bigger, 228.3 million compared to the 157.4 million spent in Curry County. And most of the spending that visitors do is on accommodations and food services. And it's just, they're fairly close and similar in a lot of ways. It's just the magnitude of visitation to Coos is slightly higher. So to understand, the differences that may be apparent in other places along the West Coast, and primarily we're focused on places that have sea otters. We will note quickly here that Newport does not have sea otters, but they do have the Oregon Coast Aquarium, which does have a sea otter exhibit. Port Angeles, Washington also does not have resident sea otters. The sea otter population is more out to the peninsula, the Olympic National Park area. But Port Angeles is one of the main gateways to travel in that region. And then again, we have Sitka, Monterey, and Morro Bay, the two California locations well known for sea otters and interactions with them. And so our goal to kind of set the stage is like looking at these communities or these counties and comparing them to our Southern Oregon coast communities. And we see that Coos and Curry are both the smallest out of the ones we've selected. And that's kind of just important to note that, as a travel destination, travel spending is big business for these counties. These are small counties in terms of population, compared to things like Monterey and San Luis Obispo, which get to pull from the San Francisco Bay Area, get to pull from the Los Angeles metropolitan area. Their travel spending is just generally higher just due to the access of individuals. But we can see that, again, there's room here to, develop that tourism product. And this is kind of important when I got back, when I was talking about the survey, where people are looking for those infrastructure amenities and services to learn about sea otters, to interact with sea otters. We kind of see like taking an inventory of businesses and services throughout these places that the Southern Oregon coast has relatively few opportunities for things like aquariums or tours, whereas you have your Monterey Bay, pretty substantial amount of supporting tourism activities that could serve wildlife. And it's similar. We look at Newport as very diverse. It has a little bit of everything compared to some of these other locations. So it's one of those things when we're trying to assess the economic impact, we were looking at like what's the possibilities with the current existing profile of the communities that were under study. So again, more details, more comparisons, but this is just on the sightseeing industry. And we can see here that like Coos County only has, in terms of what the US Census Bureau indicates, that approximately 4 businesses within Coos County offer sightseeing as like their primary business revenue, with pretty low average salary, and we don't know what their actual receipts would be because of the size. But looking at some of these other communities that are larger, known for their sightseeing opportunities, known for their sea otters or other wildlife engagements, they have a lot more establishments and higher payrolls, higher average employee salary and business receipts. And Sitka, obviously being up in Alaska and a well-known destination for wildlife and outdoor experiences, has the largest sightseeing industry of all this group, and almost double their employees take home almost double than the ones in Monterey, which is also a very popular destination. So it's really just important to highlight that like there is opportunity in terms of sightseeing and wildlife viewing, as evidenced by some of these destinations. But at the current point in time, there is not a lot of that infrastructure that currently exists. So in addition to the visitor survey that was done, Dean Runyan Associates also did a survey of guided tour businesses, sightseeing businesses throughout the West Coast. And we also asked some convention visitor bureaus or destination marketing organizations for some of their input as well. In terms of the business questionnaire, we asked a little bit about the type of tours they give, primarily motorized boat, which probably isn't surprising to a lot of individuals. And then most folks are giving tours all year round, with a small percent only offering like seasonal wildlife tours. Primarily, these businesses are serving about 6 guests for every tour, and offer approximately 150 tours on average a year. But it can go up to almost having a tour a day, or if you had multiple employees that are running multiple tours a day. But there's a lot of scale and gap there. And to do this, we wanted to evaluate eventually what we think could be increased revenue specifically to guided operations. We look at the prices of guided tours, we really see a big difference. Again, Monterey Bay, Sitka, very world-renowned destinations in terms of wildlife, and you see that they have some really high-priced tours. But generally, we look and see that the median price of a guided tour is fairly consistent across all these destinations along the coast, and same with the minimum prices. And then the price and the length are pretty well correlated. The longer the tour, the more expensive it is generally. But that average is sitting in there between 2 and 4 hours as a appropriate length of wildlife tour viewing. When we ask the businesses like where they derive their revenue from, most of it's pretty even, where they're getting about half of their revenue from the tours themselves, but then another half from like equipment rental, whether that's having a non-guided part of their business where they're just renting out, say, like a kayak or whatnot, but it's fairly evenly split between the two types of options. Then finally, just kind of close here with a small question we asked those convention visitor bureaus is just kind of the perspectives and sentiment, like how important were sea otters to draw visitors in terms of what they think is important. So most communities say that, or most of these convention visitor bureaus, these tourism marketing organizations say that sea otters' importance is really high. I think it is interesting that Newport, Oregon does use a lot of sea otter marketing, even though again we don't have a resident population along the coast, but they try to use it as a way to drive some visitation or desire to visit there. And then the types of content they use is typically images. They also have wildlife viewing guidelines in some cases. Both are important considerations for any destination looking to introduce sea otters. So to get at the economic impact of this reintroduction, we have to look at two things. One is the incremental increase in visitors and their spending related with that amount of people. And then we also wanted to look at what's the specific demand for tours. So an increase in industry specific visitor spending. Establishing economic impact for what we would consider this as like a sub-trip analysis. So like, this is a really important concept to this entire body of work is when we're analyzing travel in general, we have some key points. They either stay overnight away from home, typically in paid lodging, but they could also stay with friends and family or campgrounds. It's an overnight trip. And then you have a day trip, which is defined as 50 miles one way and a non-routine. So the goal is not to pick up somebody who may live out in the rural area that does drive 50 miles, let's say go to Costco, go to get groceries, whatever they may do. The goal is to try and represent people who are making these non-routine trips. So when you talk travel, that's pretty easy to understand. When we're trying to get to the economic impact of a purpose, it's a little there's a little more information that needs to be acquired and also more boundaries placed. So when we talk purpose, that's what we're saying, like visiting friends and relatives could be the purpose you took a trip, or you went on a business trip as your primary purpose. And then it can get even more granular, which is kind of what we've done here when we're looking at wildlife viewing of sea otter activity. You're talking about an activity that drove you to take your trip. So you would not take the trip if you didn't get to participate in the activity. So that's what we're kind of focused on with the sea otters in general. We're looking at first vacationers, and then we subset that into sightseers, so people who are choosing to go sightsee on their trip. Then of that group of sightseers, those very interested in wildlife viewing, then segment that down to those who rated their sea otters in their top 3 species of interest. And then finally, making it so that the availability of wildlife viewing is very important. So they have to rate sea otters high, and then they have to basically say, I would not make a trip to Southern Oregon unless sea otters exist. That's the group we're trying to target when we're talking about economic impact of this kind of activity. So we take those visitors motivated by the sea otter viewing activity and apply average expenditures, and we arrived at a value of $3.4 million increase in annual visitor spending. This is, I believe, approximately 1% added to the Southern Oregon coast economy. This research also aligned with other independent research done in Southern California on the tourism impact of wildlife viewing and sea otters. And then we also, again, we made a separate estimate for the increase in tour demand. So we looked at 5% to 50% increase in tours, and those businesses that currently exist, as we said, there's about 4 of them currently. If we did see an increase in sea otter visitation, those businesses as they exist today could see between 20 to $200,000 in increased annual revenue. So overall, 3.4 increase in visitor spending and about $100,000 increase in industry-specific visitor spending to come to a total of 3.5 million, or again, a 1% increase in annual travel spending to the Southern Oregon coast. The economic impact of sea otters on tourism will be variable, and it ultimately does depend on the commitment of key stakeholders like the destination marketing organizations or DMOs, local governments, business owners, tribal leaders, to ensure the success. Promoting sea otters as a tourist attraction and emphasizing wildlife tourism and marketing strategies will be crucial. Again, like we said, it's variable. There hasn't been sea otters on the Oregon coast for a long time. So we are trying to estimate something that could happen years down the line, but this activity can lead to a long-lasting and beneficial addition to the local economy. So key takeaways, Southern Oregon coast, again, it's about 386 million in direct visitor spending in 2021. Coos Bay, Brandon, Brookings welcome most of the visitors along the Southern Oregon coast. 4 days is the average amount people stay when they're staying overnight. Tour operators are the primary business category serving visitors interested in wildlife viewing. And again, really important to kind of the local visitor economy, at least for this component of travel. And additional impacts are likely with increased promotion by local tourism agencies, and again, economic development around services that would be supportive of marine life, education, and sea otter engagement. That's all I have on the topic.